Okay, welcome to this online lesson about what can artifacts tell us about Britain's relationship with its empire, linked to our inquiry question, how has the British Empire been remembered? So sources are evidence from the time, and historians use sources to form interpretations about the past. An artifact is a type of source, is an object made by a human being, which is culturally interesting and can tell us about the past. Now in 2010, a historian called Neil McGregor, who you can see pictured there, wrote an incredible book and worked with BBC Radio 4 to produce a series called A History of the World in 100 Objects. Now Neil McGregor was the director of the British Museum. Now artifacts are really useful sources for historians as they help to tell stories about the past, and they're really engaging, they're really interesting, and you can find artifacts in museums. And in this lesson we're going to focus on 4 different artifacts and what they can tell us about Britain's relationship with its empire. So Neil McGregor, he wrote a book called A History of the World in 100 Objects, and as I said, we're going to learn about 4 artifacts that are useful for finding out about Britain's relationship with its empire. So without further ado, let's find out a little bit more. So one of the things you might want to look at is have a look at this artifact and think about what it is, what do you think it might be used for, where do you think this artifact comes from, how might this artifact be linked to the British Empire, where do you think this artifact is now, and what questions might historians actually ask about this artifact. So that's something that you perhaps may want to consider, and maybe just pause the video to think about those questions, and then we'll go through some of these different ideas. So this artifact is called the Akan Drum, and it was made in the early 1700s in Ghana in West Africa. Now the drum would have been played during religious ceremonies and would have belonged to a musician in a tribal chief's orchestra. Now we know that this drum was transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the American colony of Virginia on a ship full of enslaved people on the so-called Middle Passage journey as part of the transatlantic slave trade. It was likely bought by a crew member and played when enslaved people were forced to dance. The drum was then recovered in Virginia, and historians can look at this and they can see that it was recovered using a deer skin from an American white-tailed deer. The drum was then bought in Virginia by an agent of Hans Sloane, who was a collector born in Ireland. Sloane had seen several drums like this being played by enslaved people in Jamaica as part of their cultural traditions. So the Akan Drum is in the British Museum in London, and the museum was founded in 1753 using the collection of Sir Hans Sloane. And here on this video you can see the Akan Drum up close and can see some of the detail in it, and it reveals a really vivid history and can tell us a lot about Britain's relationship with its empire. Now, the Akan Drum was one of the museum's original items, and it is its oldest African American object. So this is a really interesting artifact which can tell us a great deal about Britain's relationship with its empire. Now, the objects held within the British Museum do reveal a huge amount about Britain's relationship with its empire. All of these objects are to do with empire, and they're taken from a project called A History of the World in 100 Objects. Now, what we'd like you to think about is we're going to go through and talk about the 4 different artifacts, and you can write down what you can learn about Britain's relationship with its empire. So we're going to look at the Akan Drum in a bit more detail now. Look at the tea set, a Victorian tea set made in Staffordshire, Great Britain in the 1840s. We'll find out about something called the bark shield, which is from it was Aboriginal Australian from around 1775, and the Buckskin Map, which was Native American from the Pancashaw peoples from the 1770s. Okay, so these are the different places that these artifacts have come from, so really all around the world. We've got the tea set in Staffordshire in Britain, we've got the Buckskin Map from Native America in the 1770s, we've got the Akan Drum, and we've got the bark shield, which is Aboriginal Australian. So that's where the different places they are from around the world. So let's have a look at the Akan Drum. So the Akan Drum was made in the Akan Kingdom, West Africa, early 1700s. Is now present-day Ghana. It was played during religious ceremonies and belonged to a musician, a tribal chief's orchestra. It was transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the American colony of Virginia on a ship full of enslaved people, likely bought by a crew member and played when enslaved people were forced to dance. The drum was recovered in Virginia using a deer skin from an American white-tailed deer. The drum was bought in Virginia by an agent of Hans Sloane, a collector born in Ireland. Sloane had seen several drums like this being played by enslaved people in Jamaica as part of their cultural traditions. So what does the Akan drum tell us? Well, it reminds us of the links between Britain's empire and the transatlantic slave trade. It tells the story of how many people were taken from Africa to the Americas as part of the transatlantic slave trade. Many British colonies contained plantations where enslaved people were forced to work, like Jamaica and Barbados that we've learnt about. The drum shows how artefacts can travel into lots of different places, and it is controversial where these items should now belong. The tea set was made by Josiah Wedgwood, a famous Staffordshire pottery maker. By the 1830s, tea was being drunk by almost everyone in Britain, regardless of social status. The increase in tea's popularity required mass production, and more land in the empire was given over to growing tea and sugar. Huge tea plantations were developed in Sri Lanka and India, and new sources of sugar were found in Africa and the Caribbean. Now, tea drinking was seen as patriotic, which meant when you were doing it, you were sort of, proud of your country, as it supported British trade and strengthened the empire. So what does the tea set tell us about Britain's relationship with its empire? Well, it tells us that the British Empire allowed people in Britain to have access to exotic goods such as tea at affordable prices. All classes could drink it. A reminder of the benefits that Britain got from the British Empire. The demand for tea in Britain meant that colonies were used to mass produce goods like tea and sugar, and drinking tea was seen as patriotic because it supported the empire and its trade. The bark shield is made of bark and red mangrove wood, which grew along the East Australian coast. A shield of the same type was carried by two Indigenous Australian men who faced Captain Cook and his crew when they landed at Botany Bay, Australia. Cook's crew fired warning shots at the Indigenous men. The bark shield was dropped when the Indigenous Australian people fled. Captain Cook went on to claim Australia for the British Empire, and this encounter was seen as the beginning of European Australia. So the bark shield, the shield helps us to focus on the often violent and strained relationships between the British Empire and Indigenous people, or First Peoples. The shield tells the story of the beginning of the colonisation of Australia as part of the British Empire. Australia was later used for the transportation of prisoners. The bark shield is currently in the British Museum. Ancestors of the Indigenous Australian people believe that the artefact should be kept in Australia. Then finally, the Buckskin Map covers a large area of North America between the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers drawn by the Piankashaw Native Americans. The map was most likely created to help negotiations when the British were attempting to purchase land from Native Americans, often unfairly. The Buckskin Map tells us that the British had developed trading networks with Native American people. The map tells the story of how links between British and other groups often developed through economic agreements, and the map foretells the story of how European traders began to expand westwards and how they sought to purchase and take control of land from Native American people. Okay, so what you need to do is you need to take that information and just answer the 4 different questions. What can we learn from each artefact about Britain's relationship with empire? Looking at the Buckskin Map, the tea set, the Akan Drum, and the bark shield. Okay then, so just linking to our inquiry question, how's the British Empire been remembered? Well, artefacts from the British Museum are sources that help us remember the impact of empire. The Akan Drum reminds us that the British Empire is linked to the slave trade. Artefacts such as the bark shield remind us of how the British conquest of Australia in 1770 took lands from the Indigenous Australian people. Some people remember the British Museum itself as being controversial because many of the items in it were brought to Britain from their empire lands. And then drinking tea came to be seen as patriotic as it was a product associated with goods from the empire such as tea and sugar. So thanks very much for listening to that mini lesson about what artefacts can tell us about Britain's relationship with its empire. Thank you very much for listening.